Thank you. Well, I think that last slide illustrates poignantly the dilemma of atheism. In moments of gratitude and thankfulness for life, there's no one to thank. Whereas as a Christian theist, at least you can consistently thank God for the good things in life that we enjoy. Now, I said tonight I'm going to defend two basic contentions. First, that there's no good reason to think atheism is true. And then secondly, that there are good reasons to think that theism is true. Now, as I listened to Dr. Williamson's speech, I basically heard three arguments presented in defense of atheism. First was that negative atheism requires no proof. Negative atheism is simply the absence of belief in God. I want to submit to you that negative atheism is really just a misnomer. Atheism is what he calls positive atheism. The Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is a standard reference work in our field, says, according to the most usual definition, an atheist is a person who maintains that there is no God. That is, that the sentence, God exists, expresses a false proposition. So atheism just is the view, there is no God. What he calls negative atheism is really more accurately called non-theism. But you see, non-theism isn't a view. It's not a single view. There are all sorts of non-theists. For example, a non-theist might be your traditional atheist who thinks there is no God. But a non-theist might be an agnostic who doesn't know whether there's a God or not. Or he might be a verificationist who thinks the whole question of God's existence is meaningless. And therefore, to answer tonight's question in the negative, does God exist, to say no, Dr. Williamson needs to defend traditional, good old-fashioned atheism. Now he says, but you can't defend positive atheism because you can't prove a universal negative. Well, yes, you can. All you have to do is show that the concept involves a self-contradiction. And it's ironic that he went on to do that in his very next objection, trying to show that the concept of God is internally contradictory. So we'll have to see in a moment whether he succeeded at that. But there is a burden of proof that the atheist needs to bear if he's to convince us that there is no God. Now, Dr. Williamson also said in this connection that atheism is a practical affair. It means just living as though religion is irrelevant. Well, again, that's not atheism, because sadly, too many theists live that way. What that is secularism or nominalism. And the fact that people espouse belief in God but then live as though he's irrelevant is one of the plagues, I think, of our contemporary culture. So atheism is a view. It is a philosophical view. It is the view that God does not exist. That is a positive claim to knowledge and therefore requires justification. Secondly, he argued, there is incoherence in theism. The negativity of God's attributes or the self-contradictory nature of God's attributes show that God does not exist. I think quite to the contrary, the concept of God is quite coherent, and here I think that the critique of atheism has actually been very helpful to Christian philosophers, because critiques of atheists, like Dr. Williamson, have helped Christian theists to define the attributes of God more precisely so as to craft a coherent definition and concept of God. So, for example, take all of those attributes that he claimed need to be simply negatively defined, and I will give you better definitions for them. First, what does it mean to say that God is all-powerful? Well, to say that God is all-powerful means that God is able to do anything that it is logically possible for him to do. That's not a negative definition. What does it mean to say God is all-knowing? For a being to be all-knowing, that means that for any proposition P, that S knows that P and does not believe not P. In other words, it means for S to be omniscient is for S to believe or to know only in all truths. That's what it means to be omniscient. What does it mean to be all good? Well, a person S is all good if S is the paradigm of all moral value. Just as the meter rod in Paris was the paradigm of what it means to be a meter, God is the paradigm of moral goodness. It is defined in terms of his nature. What does it mean to say God is non-spatial? Well, S is non-spatial if S exists outside the four-dimensional space-time continuum. What does it mean to say that S is immaterial? It means that S is a mind without a body, at least in God's case. What does it mean to say that God is eternal? Well, this means that God, S, exists outside the four-dimensional space-time continuum. So those are all, I think, coherent attributes of God and leaves us with a quite positive concept of God. Now, what about omniscience? He said, omniscience leads to difficulties with respect to God's experiential knowledge of lust, for example. Well, the problem is that omniscience is defined propositionally. It's defined in terms of propositional knowledge. Remember I said that to be omniscient is for any proposition P to believe that P and not believe not P. In other words, to believe only in all true propositions. So he admits in his speech that he's not talking here about propositional knowledge. He admits God could have all the propositional knowledge there is about how to make a good slap shot, what lust is like, and so forth. But he thinks God has to have non-propositional knowledge. But that's never been the Christian concept or the classical theistic concept of God. Omniscience means God has all propositional knowledge, and Dr. Williamson admits that's coherent. So he's really just attacking a straw man here. If you're interested in reading more about this very interesting debate in philosophy of religion, I'd encourage you to look at my and J.P. Moreland's book, Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview, in which we have 2 chapters dedicated to a philosophical analysis of the principal attributes of God, including these, but several others as well. Finally, what about Jesus? He says Jesus cannot be identical with God because they have contradictory attributes. The classical Christian response to this is that Jesus of Nazareth has 2 natures. He has a divine nature and he has a human nature. So he is omnipotent with respect to his divine nature, but he is limited in power with respect to his human nature. He is omniscient with respect to the divine nature, but he is limited in knowledge with respect to his human nature. So that attributes predicated of the person of Christ need to be differentiated with respect to which nature you're speaking of, his divine or his human nature, because the incarnate Christ has 2 natures. And again, if you're interested in a wonderful philosophical analysis of this, look at Tom Morris's book, The Logic of God Incarnate, in which he shows that the classical doctrine of the incarnation is perfectly coherent logically. So I'm persuaded that these arguments against the coherence of theism are actually quite fallacious and in fact helpful to the Christian theist in framing an accurate concept of God. The third objection that Dr. Williamson raised in his opening speech was the problem of evil. How can God exist and there be evil in the world? Let me suggest that there are 2 key assumptions that Dr. Williams makes that I think are plausibly false. The first assumption is that if God is all-powerful, then he can create any world that he wants. It seems to me that that is plausibly false. If God freely creates persons who have freedom of the will, then he cannot guarantee that they will always do what is right. It is logically impossible to make someone freely choose something. That is as logically impossible as making a square circle or a married bachelor. And God's being all-powerful doesn't mean he has the ability to do the logically impossible. So the atheist would have to prove that there's a world of free creatures that God could have made, which has as much good as this world, but without as much evil. But how could the atheist possibly prove such a thing? It's just pure speculation.